The first time Belle Barrett walked into Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, every man on the main street found a reason to look away, because word had traveled faster than she had, and the word was that she was impossible. It had not always been this way. There had been a time, not so long ago, when Belle Barrett had been considered one of the finest young women in all of Wichita. She had a way of carrying herself that drew eyes without demanding them, a quality some women spent their whole lives trying to manufacture and never quite managed. She had dark auburn hair that caught the copper of sunlight and green eyes that reminded people of creek water in summer, clear all the way to the bottom if you cared to look. She could ride as well as most men, shoot better than many, and keep books for her father's general store with the kind of accuracy that would have made a bank teller envious. But that had been before Franklin Holt. Franklin Holt was a cattle broker from Wichita who wore his good looks the way some men wear borrowed clothes, proud of them, careless with them, and never quite sure they actually belonged to him. He had courted Belle for 11 months, made promises in the way men like him always do, with great feeling and very little intention. And then, when it became clear that Belle was not the kind of woman who could be made into something softer, something more convenient, he had simply walked away. And walking away had not been enough for Franklin Holt. He had needed an explanation, a reason that sat better with his own pride, and so he had given Wichita one. He said Belle Barrett was impossible to love. He said it at the Silver Horn Saloon on a Tuesday night with enough whiskey in him to feel brave and enough of an audience to feel important. He said she was cold. He said she was proud in a way that made a man feel small. He said she had a sharpness to her that cut at the wrong times and softened at no times at all. He said he had tried everything a man could try, and that Belle Barrett simply was not built for the kind of love that made a household work. The trouble with small cities and the rumors that lived in them was that they spread with the efficiency of fire and the permanence of scar tissue. Within a month of Franklin's pronouncement, the story had changed its shape the way all stories do when they pass through enough mouths. By the time it reached Caldwell, some 100 miles south, it had gathered details no one had witnessed and lost nuances no one had cared to carry. What arrived in Caldwell was simply this: Belle Barrett was impossible to love, and the man who had known her best had said so himself. What no one in Caldwell or Wichita, for that matter, had thought to ask was the obvious question. If Franklin Holt was the measure of trying, then what exactly had trying looked like? Had he listened when she spoke about things that mattered to her? Had he asked about the books she kept or the ledgers she maintained with such careful pride? Had he ever once sat beside her in the early morning quiet when she was most herself, without demanding she perform a softer version of who she was? Had he, in any meaningful sense of the word, actually tried? The answer, as anyone who knew Franklin Holt with any honesty could have told you, was no. Trying had never really been Franklin's strong suit. What he had been good at was beginning things and then resenting them for being harder than he had expected. But Belle did not spend much time thinking about Franklin Holt's failures. She had other things to attend to. She had come to Caldwell because her father, William Barrett, had died in February of that year, leaving behind a modest store on the edge of Wichita, a stack of debts that surprised everyone who thought they had known his finances, and a letter to Belle explaining that he had a brother in Caldwell named George Barrett who had offered to take her in until she found her footing. Her mother had been gone since Belle was 12. She had no siblings. She had exactly $42, a horse named Copper, and a trunk that contained everything she had decided was worth keeping from a life that had recently come apart. She had not come to Caldwell looking for kindness. She had come because it was the direction available to her, and Belle Barrett had always been the kind of woman who moved forward when standing still became unbearable. George Barrett was a decent man, wider in the waist than he had likely been in his youth and quieter in temperament than his brother William had been. He ran a small livery stable on the south end of Caldwell's Main Street, and lived in a house behind it with his wife, Martha, who was the kind of woman who communicated affection through the consistent offering of food and the strategic avoidance of difficult conversations. They welcomed Belle with genuine warmth and only a small amount of awkward silence around the subject of her recent history, which Belle appreciated more than she let on. Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town with all the energy and noise that description implied. The Kishom Trail ran right through it, and from spring through early fall the streets were thick with drovers pushing longhorns north, cowboys spending the money they had worked hard for in ways they would likely regret, and the general commerce of a town that had built itself around the fact that animals and men both needed somewhere to go after a long road. It was loud and dusty and alive in the particular way frontier towns were alive, with an edge of danger kept mostly in check by the kind of men whose job it was to keep it there. The town marshal was a man named Abe Tillman, who was competent and fair, and had been keeping Caldwell reasonably orderly for 3 years. He had 2 deputies. One of them was Jasper Sawyer. Jasper Sawyer was 28 years old in the spring of 1882, which was old enough to have learned a few hard things about the world, and young enough to still believe those lessons hadn't finished coming. He was tall in the way that came from good bone structure rather than any particular effort, with dark hair that was usually in need of cutting and brown eyes that had a habit of staying on things longer than was strictly necessary. He was not a man who spoke often, but when he did the words tended to be worth hearing, which was perhaps why people noticed the silences between them too. He had come to Caldwell 3 years before from a small town in Texas, carrying a past he didn't advertise and a set of skills that made him useful to Marshal Tillman. He could shoot, which was the obvious qualification. But more than that, he could read situations the way some men read weather, not by what was happening on the surface, but by the particular quality of quiet that came before things changed. He had a steadiness to him that had nothing to do with being unfeeling and everything to do with having felt enough that he had learned where his own edges were. He was also, as the women of Caldwell had noted and discussed at various quilting gatherings and church socials, quite thoroughly unmarried and apparently content to remain so, which was considered either admirable restraint or a personal failing, depending on who was doing the considering. The first time Jasper saw Belle Barrett, it was not a dramatic moment. She was standing outside her Uncle George's livery stable on a Wednesday morning in late April, arguing quietly but with great conviction with a man who had apparently given her horse the wrong shoes. The man was defensive in the way of someone who knew he was wrong, but was hoping volume would substitute for accuracy. Belle was calm in the way of someone who had decided that being right was enough, and that raising her voice would only give him something to point to later. Jasper was walking past on his morning round. He stopped without entirely meaning to. Not because of the argument, which he had no particular interest in involving himself in, but because of something in the way she stood, the angle of her shoulders, the complete absence of performance in her posture. She was not standing that way for anyone watching. She was standing that way because it was how she stood. He recognized the man she was arguing with as Cal Deaver, who ran a small smithing operation 2 streets over and who had a gift for confident incompetence. "Miss," Jasper said, directing his attention to Belle in a way that was careful not to be presumptuous, "is there a dispute I can help settle?" Belle turned and looked at him with the kind of direct assessment that some people found unsettling and Jasper found simply honest. "My horse was shoed wrong," she said. "The right foreleg shoe is too tight. I've told Mr. Deaver this twice, and he's told me twice that I'm mistaken, which I am not." Jasper looked at Cal Deaver, who had the expression of a man who had already decided his morning was worse than it needed to be. "Cal," Jasper said. "She don't know what she's talking about," Cal said immediately. "Check the shoe," Jasper said. Cal checked the shoe. There was a pause. Then he began removing it without further comment. Belle watched this with the kind of satisfaction that didn't need to announce itself, which Jasper noticed, and then she turned to him and said, "Thank you." "You didn't need me," he said. He was going to lose the argument either way. Something flickered in her expression that he couldn't quite name. "I know," she said, "but it's faster with a badge." He almost smiled. He was not sure he had ever been almost smiled at by someone in quite that specific way, acknowledging something true and slightly ridiculous at the same time. He introduced himself. She told him her name. He did not mention that he had heard it already, because he was not interested in letting her know that her reputation had arrived before she had. Whatever people in Wichita had decided about Belle Barrett was their business, and Jasper Sawyer was of the firm opinion that knowing what others thought about a person was among the least useful sources of information available when forming one's own views. That was Wednesday. On Thursday, he found a reason to walk past the livery stable again, which he recognized as not particularly subtle, but decided to allow anyway. She was not there. He was told by George Barrett, who was mucking out a stall at the general store buying supplies and probably already reorganizing whatever system they had in place, because she couldn't seem to help herself. Jasper found this funnier than the occasion probably warranted. He did not see her again until Sunday, at the church service that most of Caldwell attended more from social habit than deep spiritual urgency, where she sat beside Martha Barrett in the third pew from the left, and wore a blue dress that was simple and well-made, and did absolutely nothing to make her look like someone trying to impress anyone, which was, Jasper noted, exactly the kind of thing that impressed him. She caught him looking during the third hymn. He did not look away, which surprised both of them, he thought. After the service, in the light-filled chaos of a congregation dispersing into a Sunday morning, he made his way over to where she stood with Martha Barrett and two other women he knew slightly. "Miss Barrett," he said. "Deputy Sawyer," she said. The two women with Martha looked at each other with the particular attention of people filing something away for later discussion. "How are you settling in?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. "The town is loud. It gets quieter in winter," he said. "The trail closes and most of the drovers head south. I imagine that changes the character of the place considerably." "It does. You can actually hear yourself think from about November through March." She studied him for a moment. "You seem like someone who appreciates being able to think." "I seem that way?" he asked, genuinely curious about the observation. "You don't fill silences," she said. "Most people do. It's a habit, I think, filling silence. Like they're afraid of what might live there. You don't seem afraid of it." It was such a precisely accurate observation about him, made so casually and so soon, that it caught him slightly off guard. He recovered in the same breath. "Neither do you," he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then something around her eyes changed, not quite softening but shifting, the way light changes on water when something moves beneath it. "No," she said. "I don't." Martha Barrett, who had been listening to this exchange with the careful attention of a woman who was very good at watching things and very discreet about what she did with what she saw, chose that moment to suggest they all walk back together since the morning was fine. They walked. Martha and the other women led the conversation, which was about the upcoming Founders' Day celebration, and whether or not the committee was going to manage to secure a proper fiddle player this year. Belle listened and contributed occasionally. Jasper walked beside her without manufacturing any particular reason to do so, which was its own kind of reason. When they reached the Barrett's house, Belle turned to him and said, "I'm planning to walk out to the creek east of town tomorrow morning. Uncle George says there's a good view from the ridge. I'd find it useful to know if the walk is safe or if there are areas I should avoid." Jasper looked at her. The walk was safe. She almost certainly knew it was safe. George Barrett would have told her it was safe. "I'll be off duty by 7, he said. "I could show you the path if that would be useful." "That would be useful," she said. He was fairly sure they both knew this was not about the path. Monday morning was clear and cool in the particular way of Kansas spring mornings, when the sky was so blue it looked painted, and the air hadn't yet decided whether it was going to be kind or not. Belle was waiting outside the livery stable when Jasper arrived at 5 minutes past 7, wearing a practical skirt and boots that had seen real use, and carrying nothing but a canteen and the particular quality of attention she seemed to carry everywhere. They walked east out of town on a worn track that ran along the creek. The grass was high on either side, still holding some of the green that would burn off by July, and the cottonwoods along the water had their early-season leaves, that bright specific green that cottonwoods only held for a few weeks before going darker. They walked mostly in silence for the first quarter-mile, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who were paying attention to the same things and didn't need to narrate that to each other. "You grew up in Wichita," he said eventually. It was not a question, but it was open-ended. "From the age of 12, she said. "We moved from Lawrence when my mother died. My father thought a new place might help." "Did it?" "It helped him," she said simply. "I think he needed different walls to look at. I wasn't sure the walls were the problem, but I was 12 and my father was grieving, so I didn't say that." "What was the problem?" She glanced at him. "She was gone. That's not a problem that changes with walls." "No," he agreed. "It's not." They reached the ridge George had mentioned, a gentle rise of land above the creek's east bank that opened out into a wide view of the valley below, the ribbon of water catching light, the town's silhouette to the west. It was a genuinely good view. Belle stood and looked at it without speaking for a full minute, which Jasper stood through without difficulty. "My father ran a general store," she said eventually, not turning from the view. "I helped him keep the books from the time I was 16. I was good at it, better than he was, though I never said that either because he was a proud man and I loved him. That's a lot of not saying things." She turned to look at him then, and there was a directness in her face that he was already recognizing as entirely characteristic. "I said the things that mattered," she said. "I just learned to sort them first." What makes something worth saying? She thought about it. He liked that she thought about it, that she didn't produce an answer immediately the way some people did, reflex dressed up as reflection. "Whether it changes anything," she said, "or whether it honors something true, either one is worth saying. Everything else is just sound." He found himself wanting to tell her something true then, something that qualified under her own definition, and he was mildly startled by the want of it. "I heard about you before you arrived," he said. "From someone in town who had heard from someone in Wichita. I didn't tell you that on Wednesday." She went still for just a moment, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of stillness that comes from someone bracing. Then she turned fully toward him and her chin came up just slightly. "And what did you hear?" she asked. "That you were impossible to love," he said. "From a man named Holt." The stillness held. Then something crossed her face that was not quite hurt and not quite anger. It was more tired than either of those things, more worn, the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that they had stopped being surprised by the weight. "Franklin Holt," she said. "Yes. And you came to look at me anyway," she said. "After church." "And offered to walk out here." "I came to form my own opinion," he said, "which I was taught is the decent thing to do when handed someone else's." She was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved below them. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles over the valley. "And what is your opinion?" she asked, and he could hear the carefully maintained neutrality in her voice, the way she was keeping it level by effort. "That Franklin Holt is a man who called something impossible when what he meant was that he found it inconvenient," Jasper said. "Which is not the same thing at all. And that trying is the part he apparently got wrong from the start." Belle Barrett looked at him with those green eyes that had creek water in them, and for a moment her face was completely unguarded, every careful layer of protection she kept in place just briefly suspended, and what was underneath was not coldness or sharpness or any of the things Franklin Holt had described. What was underneath was someone who had been paying very close attention to the world for a very long time and had found very few people who paid equal attention back. Then she looked away, back at the valley, and took a slow breath. "That is a generous interpretation," she said. "It's an honest one," he said. They walked back to town after that, and the silence between them was different now. Not merely comfortable but inhabited. Two people who had shared something real and were carrying it side by side. He saw her the next day and the day after, not by manufacturing occasions, but by the natural arithmetic of a small town where certain paths crossed at certain times. She had found work quickly, because Belle Barrett did not sit idle, the owner of Caldwell's only general store. A man named Harmon Webb, who was competent at running a business and terrible at keeping its records, had hired her within her first week to manage his books and organize his inventory. She was good at it with the particular efficiency of someone who found genuine satisfaction in order. Jasper made a habit of stopping in for coffee in the mornings, which Harmon kept on a small stove near the back. Belle was usually behind the counter or working at the ledger desk in the back room, and their conversations were short but cumulative, building the way rivers build from many small tributaries, each one adding to something larger without any single contribution announcing itself as significant. He learned things about her in those conversations. That she had opinions about literature, having gotten through most of what the Wichita Lending Library had offered before it occurred to anyone to tell her that women weren't officially supposed to borrow certain of the volumes. That she had a particular attachment to her horse copper, not the sentimental attachment of someone who had anthropomorphized an animal, but the practical deep attachment of someone who had spent a lot of time alone and found that horses, being honest creatures, were good company. That she missed her father steadily and without drama, the way you miss something permanent, not in waves but as a constant low frequency. She learned things about him too. He had grown up in a small town in the Texas Hill Country, the second of 4 children, in a family that had been neither very rich nor very poor but had been, in the way that mattered most, attentive. His father had been a rancher with a quiet philosophy about the importance of doing small things correctly, on the theory that small things correctly done added up to large things correctly made. His mother had been a schoolteacher who read to her children every evening without fail, and who had given Jasper, among other things, the habit of silence as a thing worth preserving rather than filling. He had come to Caldwell after a period he did not immediately detail, a period that had included a marriage proposal he had made at 23 to a woman named Sarah who had accepted it, and then, 18 months later, had decided that the life she actually wanted was not the one she had been willing to commit to, which had been painful in the clean, sharp way of losses that are complete. He told Belle about Sarah in late May, on their 4th or 5th walk out to the creek, because it seemed dishonest not to, and because the kind of conversation they were having by then required honesty as its foundation. Belle listened without interrupting, which was characteristic, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment and then said, "That sounds like it made you careful." "It made me thoughtful," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Careful means you move to protect yourself," he said. "Thoughtful means you move to understand the situation clearly before you move at all. The first is about defense. The second is about accuracy." She turned to look at him. "You've thought about this?" "I've had time," he said. "So have I," she said, and something in her voice told him they were talking about more than time. June came in hot and golden, and the trail was thick with cattle and the men who drove them. And Caldwell at its busiest was a different animal entirely from Caldwell in the quiet of an ordinary week. Jasper's days grew longer and his evenings shorter, and the conversations at the general store became their own kind of currency, brief but dense, carrying more than the words themselves. It was during the 2nd week of June that something happened that changed the specific nature of what was growing between them, from a thing they were both carefully not naming to a thing that named itself, whether they were ready or not. There was a drover named Cutter who had come in off the trail with a Texas crew, and who had the specific kind of dangerous energy that came from a man who thought confidence was the same thing as entitlement. He had been in the Silver Horn Saloon for most of the day, and by evening was in the kind of state that made him louder and less reasonable than he had been to begin with. He decided, in his diminished state, that Belle Barrett, whom he had noticed at the general store that afternoon, was someone he wanted to speak to. Belle was closing up the store when Cutter appeared in the doorway. Harmon Webb had already left for the evening. The street outside was loud with the sounds of a town in full cattle season swing, and in the noise and the gathering dark, the specifics of one man in one doorway were not the kind of thing that attracted attention. Belle looked at him steadily. "Store's closed," she said. "I ain't here for the store," Cutter said, and took a step inside. "Then I'd ask you to turn around," she said, "and walk back out the way you came." He laughed in a way that was not amused. "You're a serious one, aren't you?" "I'm closing up," she said, "and you're not welcome here after hours." He took another step and Belle took a step back, not from fear. Her face had not changed its expression of flat, controlled steadiness, but from practical calculation, getting distance between herself and the desk at her back. Jasper had been making his evening round when he heard something not quite right in the quality of silence coming from the general store. It was not a sound, exactly. It was the absence of the usual sound of a business closing up. He had been trained to notice exactly this kind of absence, and he moved toward it before he had consciously formed a reason. He stepped through the doorway and took in the scene Cutter, who he recognized from the registration at the hotel, 3 steps inside the store, Belle behind the counter, a kerosene lamp on the counter between them, her face composed and her hands still. "Evening," Jasper said. Cutter turned. He recognized the badge. Men in his state usually made one of 2 decisions at the sight of a badge. They either settled or they escalated, and the decision usually happened in the first 2 seconds. Cutter settled which was the right decision. "Deputy," he said. "Store's closed," Jasper said, "and Miss Barrett has asked you to leave." Cutter looked back at Belle, then at Jasper, and then he made the kind of exit that was designed to preserve dignity but did not quite manage it, and the door closed behind him. Jasper looked at Belle. She had not moved from behind the counter. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I had it in hand." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Then why do you look like that?" "Like what?" "Like something shook loose," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them threw warm light. Outside, the town was loud and ordinary and entirely unconcerned. "Because something did," he said. The honesty of it landed between them like something placed there deliberately. Belle looked at him for a long moment with those direct Creekwater eyes, and then she came around from behind the counter and stood on the same side of the room as him for the first time in a confined space, and the distance between them was less than it had ever been. "Jasper," she said, and his name in her mouth was different from how anyone else said it, more deliberate, like she had chosen it. "Belle," he said. And then she said something he had not expected. She said, "I was not cold. I was not impossible. I was just myself, and Franklin Holt didn't know what to do with that, and so he decided the problem was mine to carry." "I know," Jasper said. "I need you to actually know it," she said. "Not just as information, as something you believe." "I believe it," he said. "I have believed it since Wednesday morning and a horse with the wrong shoe." Something in her face broke open then, gently, the way ice breaks on a creek in spring, not violently but inevitably, with the relief of something that has been waiting for the right temperature. And then she laughed quietly, a real laugh, the kind that surprised even her. "That was a very ordinary first impression," she said. "The best ones usually are," he said. He reached out and took her hand, which was there to take, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him, and there was nothing complicated in her face in that moment. There was something simple and enormous. They stayed like that for a moment in the lamplight of the closed store, with the noise of Caldwell carrying on outside around them, indifferent to the fact that something significant had just occurred in its general store. Then Belle squeezed his hand once and let go and picked up the lamp. "Walk me home?" she asked. "Yes," he said. The summer of 1882 in Caldwell was one that both of them would remember with the specific clarity that attaches to important time. the way certain seasons leave marks that fainter ones do not. They walked together in the early mornings before the town was fully awake, and in the evenings when the heat eased and the sky went the color of a cooling coal. They had supper at the Barrett house regularly, where Martha noticed everything and said almost nothing, and where George, who was perceptive in the quiet way of men who work with animals, watched Jasper Sawyer with his niece and seemed to reach some private conclusion that satisfied him. Belle kept working at the general store, and Harmon Webb, who had more than a little noticed the improvement in his books since she had taken them over, gave her increasing responsibility and increasing pay, which she accepted without false modesty because she had earned it. She organized his inventory system in a way that saved him money he hadn't known he was losing, tracked the seasonal patterns of his sales with the kind of disciplined attention that her father would have recognized and been proud of, and within 2 months had essentially transformed the financial health of his business. Jasper, for his part, was doing his job in a town that required it. The cattle season brought complications that the quiet season didn't, and he and Marshal Tillman and the other deputy, a man named Price, kept the peace of Caldwell with the combination of presence, firmness, and the occasional creative diplomacy that real law enforcement in a cattle town actually required. He was good at it. He was good at it because he was patient, and because he could read people, and because he genuinely believed, in the way of someone who had thought about it carefully, that most trouble started because people felt unheard, and that being heard was something he could offer at very low cost to himself. He told Belle this on a July evening when they were sitting on the porch of the Barrett house after supper, in the surviving heat of a day that had been genuinely unpleasant in the sun and was still warm in the shade. George and Martha had gone inside. The street beyond the house was quieter than it had been all day. "You think most people just want to be heard," she said. "I think a remarkable amount of conflict starts because someone feels they haven't been," he said. "Not all of it. Some trouble starts from greed or meanness that has nothing to do with feeling unheard, but more than you'd expect." She was quiet for a moment. The evening air moved barely. A dog barked somewhere 2 streets over. "Franklin never heard me," she said, not with bitterness but with the clean, factual quality she brought to true things. "Not for lack of me speaking. I was quite clear about who I was. He just kept listening for someone else. He wanted the version of you that existed in his idea of who you should be," Jasper said. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. That must have been exhausting," he said. "Being yourself clearly and consistently and watching someone look straight through it." She turned to look at him. "It was," she said, "and it made me wonder after long enough if the problem was the clarity, if I should have been less clear, less myself." "And?" he asked. "And I couldn't do it," she said. "Even when I tried, I couldn't maintain the performance. I kept coming back to myself because I didn't know how to be anywhere else." "That's not a flaw," he said. "That's integrity." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he had come to recognize as her equivalent of being moved, not demonstrative, never that, but deeply attentive, as if she were memorizing the shape of something. "You say things like they're just obvious," she said. "They are obvious," he said. "They're only obscure because other people keep making them complicated." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that watching the evening sky go dark and the first stars appear above the line of the rooftops. And Belle Barrett said nothing at all, which, as he had learned, was how she was loudest. August brought heat that made June seem mild, and with the heat came a situation that tested the season in a different way. A man named Delaney arrived in Caldwell claiming to be a land agent, representing investors from back east who were looking to buy up grazing land south of town. He was polished in the way of men from cities who had learned how to look prosperous whether they were or not, and he moved through Caldwell with the smooth ease of someone practiced at making himself agreeable. He found, in the general store, the extremely well-organized books of Harmon Webb. He found, keeping those books, Belle Barrett. And he found in Belle Barrett someone whose clear-eyed manner and evident competence he decided to deploy for his own purposes. He offered her a position. He described it as bookkeeping for the land acquisition company, excellent pay, more than Harmon was paying, work that would expand her skills. He said all of this in the general store on a Wednesday afternoon, with the kind of polished certainty of someone who had made this particular speech before. Belle listened to the whole thing without expression. Then she asked him 3 questions. What were the names of the Eastern investors? What was the legal structure of the land acquisition company? And had any of the ranchers whose land he was interested in been formally approached, or was he still in what he called a preliminary phase? Delaney's smooth manner developed a small but visible crack. Those are quite specific questions for someone simply being offered a job, he said. I'm a quite specific person, Belle said. And I'd prefer to understand who I'd be working for before I agree to work for them. He gave her answers that were vague in specific ways she noticed, and told her she had 24 hours to decide. She told Jasper that evening. She laid out everything Delaney had said, and her own reservations about it with the precision of someone who had been building a case. Jasper listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The Emery brothers run the land south of town, he said, both of them. Their father built that operation from nothing and they've run it well for 15 years. Has Delaney approached them? I'll find out tomorrow, Jasper said. He found out the next day. Delaney had not approached the Emery brothers through any legitimate legal channel. What he had done was file a series of preliminary acquisition claims through a Dodge City land office using names that the Dodge City registry, when Jasper sent a wire, had no record of. The Eastern investors were not real. What was real was a scheme that had apparently worked in 2 other Kansas towns, wherein Delaney would manufacture legal-looking documents suggesting contested ownership of land, pressure the actual owners into selling at low prices to avoid a costly fight, and then sell on the clear title to actual buyers at full market value, keeping the difference. Marshal Tillman arrested Delaney on Thursday morning. The evidence, assembled in part from the questions Belle had thought to ask and the wires Jasper had thought to send, was sufficient. Delaney was transferred to Dodge City by the end of the week, which was the last Caldwell saw of him. The Emery brothers came to thank Belle personally, which she received with characteristic directness and minimum fuss. She told them she was glad the situation had been resolved and asked if they had a reliable system for tracking their land documentation, and within 20 minutes had identified 3 improvements they could make to their record-keeping that would protect them against similar situations in the future. Jasper, watching this from across the room, felt something settle in him that he recognized as the particular piece of certainty. He had been thinking about a specific conversation for several weeks. He had been thinking about the right moment, the right way, the right words, because Belle Barrett was someone for whom words and the intention behind them mattered, and he did not want to get any of it wrong. He had thought about it carefully in the precise way she had identified, not carefully to protect himself, but thoughtfully to get it right. He asked her one evening in late August to take the morning walk to the creek with him on Saturday, and she said yes with the straightforward pleasure of someone who wanted to. And on Saturday morning, they walked east out of town through the late summer grass that had gone golden and rustling with the season's change. At the ridge above the creek, where they had stood on their very first morning walk together 4 months before, he stopped. The sky was the clear, brilliant blue of a Kansas August morning, the air still cool with what would burn off by afternoon. The valley below was bright and particular, and the hawk or one very like it was working the thermals over the water. He turned to face her. "I have something to say," he said. "I know," she said. She was watching him with absolute attention, no part of her elsewhere. "I have been thinking about what trying means," he said. "Not as an abstract thing, but specifically in practice with a specific person. And I have come to the conclusion that trying is not a grand gesture. It is not a single heroic moment. It is the willingness to show up in the ordinary moments with your full attention, to listen when someone is being clear about who they are, instead of listening for who you want them to be. To choose someone, not the version of them you've imagined, but the actual person standing in front of you. Belle was still. There is a man who told a roomful of people in Wichita that you were impossible to love, Jasper said. And I think the truth is simpler and harder for him to face than that. The truth is that he never tried. Not really. Because trying is the part that man got entirely wrong. And I have been standing next to you since April, paying as close attention as I know how, and everything I've found is worth finding. You are the clearest, most genuinely honest person I have been near in a very long time, and I am in love with you, Belle Barrett. There was a moment that contained, in its small compass, a great deal. Belle looked at him. Her face went through something private and significant, something he could not entirely read but felt the weight of. Then she took a slow breath that was not entirely steady. "Jasper," she said. "Yes," he said. "I have been in love with you since the morning you said the words. I came to form my own opinion," she said. "Which I was taught is the decent thing to do when handed someone else's. I have been in love with you since then, and I have been watching you prove every day since that you actually meant them, and I need you to know that I am not easy. I am not the version of simple that makes a man's life easier. I am myself, which is sometimes complicated and often direct and not always convenient." "I know," he said. "I'm not in love with the easier version. I'm in love with the one in front of me." She stepped forward and put her hands against his chest and looked up at him, and her eyes were bright in the morning light. "Then we agree," she said. He kissed her on the ridge above the creek on a Saturday morning in late August of 1882, with the hawk overhead and the valley below, and the golden Kansas grass moving in a slight warm wind. And it was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning so much as a confirmation of something that had been building toward itself for months. When they walked back to town, the world was exactly as it had been an hour before, and also entirely different. September in Caldwell was the beginning of the season's slowdown. The cattle drives thinning as the northern markets filled, and the drovers turned south again. The town breathed differently in September, looser and quieter, and in that quieter register Jasper and Belle were simply themselves in public in a way they had been only beginning to learn in the busy summer months. They walked together openly. They were seen at suppers together and at church together, and at the general store where Belle worked. And Caldwell, which had received her with the weight of Wichita's opinion, revised itself with the organic efficiency of a community watching something unfold that it could see plainly with its own eyes. What Caldwell's own eyes told it was that Belle Barrett was not cold or impossible or any of the things the rumor had described. She was precise and honest and occasionally brisk, and she had made Harmon Webb's store more profitable than it had ever been, and she had helped stop a land fraud scheme, and she kept excellent company for Deputy Jasper Sawyer, who was a man Caldwell both respected and liked. The rumor from Wichita, deprived of any supporting evidence, did what rumors without evidence eventually do. It simply stopped being interesting. There was one afternoon in late September when the specific ghost of Franklin Holt visited them in the most direct way possible, which was that Franklin Holt himself arrived in Caldwell. He was there on business, cattle brokerage business, and his arrival was coincidental in the strict sense of the word. He had not come to find Belle, but Caldwell was not a large town, and the general store was on the main street, and on the second morning of his stay, he walked in to buy tobacco and found behind the counter the woman he had publicly declared impossible to love. Belle saw him before he saw her. Jasper happened to be at the back of the store with his morning coffee, watching from where the lamp threw less light. He saw the moment she recognized Holt, the way she went completely still for exactly 1 second and then straightened and did not move from her position behind the counter. Franklin Holt stopped when he recognized her. He had the particular discomfort of a man who knows he has behaved badly and is now being presented with the evidence. "Belle," he said. "Franklin," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "Can I help you with something?" He looked around the store with the expression of someone buying time. "Just tobacco," he said. "I didn't know you were in Caldwell." "I've been here since April," she said, and took the tobacco he specified from the shelf behind her and placed it on the counter with the price. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that might have been regret or might simply have been discomfort in the presence of regret's shadow. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He paid. He made a movement toward something further, some other sentence that had taken shape in whatever passed for his conscience, and then he became aware of Jasper Sawyer at the back of the store, watching with the patient attentiveness of a man who had no plans to speak, but no plans to look away either. Franklin Holt picked up his tobacco and left. Belle stood behind the counter for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Then she looked toward the back of the store and found Jasper already moving toward her. He came around to her side of the counter without speaking and stood beside her close, and she turned so their shoulders were touching. "All right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. And then, after a pause, "Yes, actually, I am." He could hear in those two words the difference between the first yes, which was automatic, and the second, which was true. He said nothing, which was the right thing. Franklin Holt left Caldwell the following morning. No one particularly marked his passing. October arrived with the first serious cold and the particular beauty of Kansas autumn, and Jasper Sawyer asked Belle Barrett to marry him on a Thursday evening in the Barrett parlor with George and Martha elsewhere in the house, and a fire in the hearth, and everything as ordinary as he could make it, because he wanted her to know that this was not about grand occasions, but about the ordinary life he wanted to build with her in it. He had no ring yet because he wanted her to choose one, which he explained before she had a chance to answer, because it seemed to him that a woman who had as specific and well-formed a sense of herself as Belle Barrett would have opinions about what she wanted on her finger for the rest of her life, and those opinions were her right to exercise. Belle looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes," just that. Yes. But the way she said it made it the largest word in the room. They chose the ring together at the jeweler's on Saturday. A simple gold band with a small green stone that Belle pointed to immediately and did not second-guess, which was characteristic. Jasper put it on her finger in the jeweler's shop on a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning, and Belle held her hand up to the light and looked at the green stone catching it and said, "This is right." "Yes," he said. "I mean the ring," she said, and there was something warm and private in her voice that he recognized as the rarest of things, Belle Barrett being deliberately teasing. "I know what you meant," he said. "Do you?" she said. "I think you meant both," he said. She looked at him and smiled, and Belle Barrett's smiles were not frequent enough to be taken for granted and were therefore, when they came, the most generous things he had ever been given. They were married on the 12th of November, 1882, in the small church on Caldwell's Main Street, in a ceremony that was simple and warm, and exactly what both of them had wanted without having needed to discuss it at any length, because they had discovered, among other things, that they often wanted the same things. Martha Barrett cried with the steady, discreet efficiency of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this, and is not going to pretend otherwise. George Barrett shook Jasper's hand with both of his and said, "You're a good man, Sawyer," which was the most George Barrett had said about any emotional topic in recent memory, and therefore carried considerable weight. Harmon Webb closed the store for the morning. Marshall Tillman and his wife attended. Several of the townspeople who had revised their opinions of Belle over the summer attended and were genuinely glad. They moved into a house on the east side of Caldwell that Jasper had been renting for 2 years, and that Belle immediately, and without ceremony, began improving. She moved the furniture to better positions, replaced a curtain that was beyond saving, organized the kitchen shelving in a way that made immediate sense, and then stood in the middle of the main room and looked at what they had and said, "This is a good house." "It is now," Jasper said. She gave him the look she reserved for things he said that she found simultaneously sentimental and accurate. They lived in Caldwell, and they built their life in it with the same quality of attention they had brought to everything else. Belle continued at the general store through the winter of 1882 and into 1883, and by spring had effectively become Harmon Webb's partner in all but name, a situation that Harmon, who was aging and whose knees had begun giving him significant trouble, resolved formally in May of 1883 by offering her a partnership stake in the business in exchange for taking over a larger portion of its management. Belle accepted and made the arrangement work with the same competence that had characterized everything she touched. Jasper continued his work as deputy through 1883, and in the early months of 1884 was offered, upon Marshal Tillman's retirement, the position of town marshal. He thought about it with characteristic care. He talked it through with Belle at the kitchen table on a January evening with the fire going and the winter dark pressed against the windows, and she listened to him think through it aloud and then said what she thought, which was that he was the most genuinely fair person she had encountered in a professional context, and that Caldwell would benefit from his fairness in the marshal's office. "That's not the same as saying I should take it," he said. "No," she said. "Whether you should take it is a different question." "That's about what you want. I'm answering a different one." He looked at her. "What question were you answering?" "Whether you'd be good at it," she said. "You would." "Exceptionally. What you want is your own business to sort out." He took the job. He sorted out, as she had correctly identified was his own business to do, that what he wanted was to be useful in a place he intended to stay for a long time, and that being Marshal of Caldwell satisfied those conditions. He was sworn in March of 1884 and was a good marshal, thorough and fair, and exactly as patient as the position required. In the spring of 1884, Belle told him she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday morning before church, with the same directness she brought to all important information, and watched his face with the careful attention she always brought to moments that mattered. His face did what it rarely did entirely in public. It was open and unguarded, and it showed everything he felt, which was something so complete that it did not have a simple name. "When?" he asked. "October," she said. "From what I can determine." He crossed to where she was standing and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a long moment and then put his forehead against hers. "Belle," he said. "I know," she said. Their son, William Jasper Sawyer, was born on the 18th of October, 1884, on a bright cold fall morning that announced itself with the particular clear quality of light that comes after an autumn storm. Belle endured the whole of it with the combination of physical courage and practical focus that had characterized her in every hard situation Jasper had observed. And when it was done, and the doctor had pronounced everything well, and the infant had been placed in her arms, she looked at the baby with an expression that was new, not an expression he had seen before, but one he recognized immediately as something fundamental and permanent, something that had always been there waiting for its occasion. She looked up at him. He was sitting beside the bed with his hand over hers. "He looks like your father in that photograph," she said. "He does," Jasper agreed, which was true, and which was something he had not expected to feel as much as he did. "William was my father's name," she said. "I know," he said. "It fits." They named him William Jasper, and he was called Will from his first week, which suited him in the way that practical names suit practical children, and Will Sawyer proved from the beginning to be a child of considerable determination and curiosity, characteristics that surprised no one who knew his parents. George and Martha Barrett became devoted grandparents in the manner of people who have been waiting for the opportunity, without knowing they were waiting. Martha came every day for the first 2 weeks and brought food that could have sustained a settlement, and George held the baby with the concentrated, careful attention he usually reserved for horses, which was a comparison Martha found less charming than Jasper did. Caldwell in the mid-1880s was changing in the way frontier towns changed as the frontier itself moved further west, a little more settled, a little less raw at the edges, with more families and fewer transients and the kinds of businesses that followed families. A school that grew, a second church, a doctor who stayed rather than passing through. Belle watched this change with the interest of someone who cared about the community she was now genuinely part of, and when the school needed a new schoolhouse and the town committee was trying to figure out how to finance it, she sat down with their records and showed them 3 ways to fund the construction that did not require additional burden on the residents. The school was built in 1886. Belle served on its governing committee for 4 years. Jasper ran his office with quiet authority and an absolute consistency that made Caldwell, over the years of his tenure, one of the more orderly cattle towns in southern Kansas. He was not the most famous marshal in the region, which was a distinction he had no interest in. He was the most reliable, which was a distinction that mattered more to the people who lived under his care. They had their second child in 1887, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived with an ease that contrasted pleasantly with the anxiety of the first time, and who, from her earliest months, seemed to possess the particular quality of effortless warmth that neither of her parents could entirely claim, but both of them deeply admired. Clara laughed easily and trusted readily, and had her father's brown eyes and her mother's copper-auburn hair, and she was adored by Will in the particular way of a 3-year-old brother who has decided a new acquisition is acceptable and intends to supervise it closely. Belle, watching Will instruct his infant sister on the subjects he found important, which at 3 were horses, rocks, and the activities of their hound dog Samuel, said to Jasper one evening, "He is entirely his own person, that one." "He is," Jasper agreed. "He got that from you." "He got it from both of us," she said. "You are also entirely your own person, Jasper Sawyer. You are simply quieter about it." He smiled. He had gotten better at smiling over the years with her, which was not because she had changed him into a different person, but because being genuinely known made certain things that had been effortful become effortless. In the spring of 1888, when Will was 3 and Clara was just past a year old, there was a situation that brought the past back into the present in a way neither of them had anticipated. A letter came from Wichita, from a woman named Dot Carver, who had been a friend of Belle's in her Wichita years. The letter was warm and newsy and contained, toward its end, a piece of information delivered as casually as gossip always is delivered, which was that Franklin Holt had married a woman named Agnes the previous fall, and that, from what Dot had heard, things were not going particularly well, which Dot presented without commentary but clearly expected Belle to receive with some feeling. Belle read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, and then set it down and picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the yard, where Will was supervising Samuel's attempt to dig under the fence. Jasper came in from outside, having checked on Copper, who was aging now but still in good condition, and still, when Belle rode her on Sunday mornings, the same steady, reliable animal she had always been. "Letter," Belle said, nodding toward it. He read it. He set it down. He looked at her. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "About Franklin," she said. "Nothing, really. That part of my life is so far away that it's more like something I read once than something I lived." She paused. "I feel something for Agnes, whoever she is. If what Dot is implying is true, she's learning what I learned, which is that Franklin wants a woman who will be whatever he needs in the moment." "That's a hard thing to learn." "Yes," he said, "but that's not mine to manage," she said. "She doesn't know me and I don't know her, and I can only hope she's the kind of woman who figures out her own worth before he convinces her otherwise." Jasper sat down across from her. "You figured out yours," he said. She looked at him. "I never lost it," she said. "That's the part Franklin got wrong. He thought he was showing me something about myself when he said what he said. But the flaw was always in the seeing, not the thing being seen." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned it over and held his. "You knew that from the beginning," he said. "I did," she said. "Even when it hurt, I always knew." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was something he had done since the early months of their marriage, and which Belle had never indicated she minded even slightly. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said, without hesitation, which was not always how Belle said things but was always how she said that. Will chose that moment to appear at the kitchen door with Mud to his elbows and Samuel behind him, wagging the specific guilty wag of a dog who has been part of something inadvisable. Samuel got out, Will announced. "I can see that," Belle said, with a tone that contained both the mild exasperation and the deep helpless affection of a mother looking at her muddy, entirely his own person 3-year-old son. Jasper stood and went to deal with the Mud situation, and Belle folded Dot's letter neatly and set it aside and did not unfold it again, because it had delivered its news and she had no further use for it. The years moved the way good years move, full of the texture of ordinary days, the particular accumulation of moments that don't announce themselves as significant but that constitute, in aggregate, the substance of a life that is being genuinely lived. Will Sawyer grew into a boy who was bright and energetic, and had his mother's clear honesty and his father's patient attention, a combination that made him interesting to be around and occasionally exhausting, since he was very thorough about both things. Clara grew into a girl who was warm and quick, and had a way of making people feel genuinely welcomed that seemed to require no effort from her, which was something her parents watched with the private marvel of people who recognize in their children qualities they aspire to themselves. Belle continued to manage the general store, which by the late 1880s had expanded once Harmon Webb having sold his partnership stake to her entirely in 1888 upon his full retirement, citing his needs and a desire to spend his remaining years without inventory concerns. She ran it with the competence that had always characterized her, and it was as good a store as Caldwell had, known for its fair prices and accurate inventory and the specific quality of service that came from someone who was genuinely organized. Jasper ran his office with the same quiet consistency. Caldwell was calmer in the late 1880s than it had been in its peak cattle years, and the nature of his work shifted accordingly, less managing the volatile energy of trail drives and more the steady maintenance of a community's order, the resolution of disputes, the occasional more serious matter handled with the same careful precision he brought to everything. In 1890, Belle told him she was expecting again. She was 31 and he was 36, and Will was 5 and Clara was 3, and the news settled into the household with a warmth that was entirely its own texture. Their second daughter was born in December of 1890, arriving in the middle of a Kansas winter that had been making itself known with considerable conviction, and she was named Ruth, after Jasper's mother who had died the previous year. Ruth Sawyer was a quiet baby who regarded the world with a seriousness that suggested she was forming opinions and was not yet ready to share them, which Belle recognized immediately as a characteristic she understood and which Jasper found, for reasons he did not entirely analyze, specifically moving 3 children, a store, a marshal's office, a house that had grown in small ways over the years, a room added here, a porch extended there to accommodate the life growing inside it, a horse named Copper who had grown old in the company of good care and was retired from riding but lived contentedly in the paddock behind the livery, a hound named Samuel who had dug under every fence in the property at least once and who was adored by all 3 children without reservation. These were the things of their life, and they were good. There was a morning in the spring of 1891 when Jasper woke before dawn, as he often did, and lay for a moment listening to the particular quiet of the house asleep. Will and Clara and Ruth in their rooms, the horse in the paddock, the dog who slept on the porch and occasionally talked in his sleep, the faint sound of the town beyond, Caldwell breathing in its sleep the way towns do, and Belle beside him, asleep in the particular way she slept on her side, facing the window, with the ease of someone whose conscience is clear, and whose mind, which was always so active when she was awake, had finally agreed to let itself rest. He had thought, on the morning he had first seen her arguing about a horse shoe outside a livery stable, that she was worth paying attention to. He had been right about that. He had thought, on the ridge above the creek when he had told her he was in love with her, that she was worth the trying. He had been right about that too. He had been right in the specific way that comes not from luck but from paying close enough attention to know what you are looking at. She had been called impossible to love by a man who had never tried, and the specific irony of that, which Jasper had thought about with increasing clarity over the years, was not that the man had been wrong about Belle, though he had been, in every particular. The irony was that trying was precisely the part that man had gotten wrong. Trying in the sense of genuine effort, genuine presence, genuine willingness to see the actual person and not the imagined version, was not something Franklin Holt had attempted. He had attempted something else, some performance of effort, some token gesture toward knowing her, and when the performance had failed to produce the result he expected, he had declared the other person the problem. Jasper had tried. He had tried from the first Wednesday morning through every morning since, and what he had found in the trying was not difficult or cold or impossible. What he had found was exact and honest and extraordinary, a woman who said only what she meant, who knew who she was with a clarity that was not arrogance but simple self-knowledge, who kept her promises, who loved him with the same precise completeness she brought to everything she cared about, who had built a life with him that was real and warm and full, a life that was nothing like impossible and everything like the most straightforward thing either of them had ever done, provided you understood that straightforward did not mean easy, and that worth doing was not the same as without difficulty. It was simply, at its core, two people who had paid attention to each other. Two people who had chosen each other not from the comfortable place of certainty, but from the harder and more honest place of clear-eyed decision, and who renewed that decision in the small daily ways that actually constitute a choice. The morning conversations, the evening walks, the hands held across a kitchen table, the silence shared without the compulsion to fill it, the particular specific love of knowing someone as they actually are and being known in the same way. Belle shifted beside him and then was still again. She made a soft sound that was not quite a word. He watched the room's darkness lighten by imperceptible degrees as dawn considered itself somewhere beyond the window. He was not a man who offered sentiment easily or often. He had not been raised that way, and it did not come naturally. But in the privacy of a spring morning with his family asleep and his life as settled and right as it had ever been, he let himself feel the full weight of what he had, without deflection or qualification, and it was very large. Later that morning, at the kitchen table with coffee and the particular organized controlled chaos of 3 children at breakfast, Belle looked up from helping Ruth with her cup and caught his eye across the table. She had that expression, the one that was her version of being moved, more attentive than a smile and deeper than warmth, the specific look she had for things she found both accurate and sentimental. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Jasper." "I was thinking," he said, "about—" Will had spilled something and was dealing with it with characteristic thoroughness. Clara was explaining to Samuel through the window that he could not come in for breakfast. Ruth was considering her spoon with the serious philosophical inquiry she brought to unfamiliar objects. "About the ridge above the creek," he said, "and a horse with the wrong shoes." Belle was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved slowly into something that was unmistakably a smile. "You think about that," she said. "Occasionally," he said. "So do I," she said. Will resolved his spill. Clara finished her negotiation with Samuel. Ruth decided the spoon was acceptable. The morning went on in all its ordinary particulars, and Jasper and Belle sat across the table from each other in the comfortable inhabited silence of two people who had nothing left to prove to each other and a great deal left to do together. That summer they took the children out to the ridge above the creek on a Saturday morning, all five of them, with a basket of food that Martha Barrett had insisted on packing, because Martha Barrett's love language remained the strategic deployment of provisions. The grass on the way there was tall and green with the good spring rains they'd had, and Will ran ahead and came back and ran ahead again, and Clara held Jasper's hand most of the way and talked continuously about a great variety of subjects, and Ruth rode on Belle's back because she was 4 and her legs were shorter than her ambitions. At the ridge, they spread out in the light and ate and watched the valley below and the creek catching the morning sun and the hawk, or its descendant, 9 years on working the thermals above the water. Will came and stood beside his father and looked at the view with the focused attention that always reminded Jasper of his mother. "Why do we always come here?" Will asked. Jasper looked over at Belle, who was sitting in the grass with Ruth in her lap and Clara leaning against her shoulder, looking back at him. "It's where something important happened," Jasper said. "What?" Will asked. Jasper looked at the valley, the creek moved, the hawk turned. "Your mother agreed to walk somewhere with me," he said. Will considered this. "That's it. That's enough," Jasper said. Will thought about this with the serious deliberativeness of a 7-year-old evaluating information. "I don't think I understand that yet," he said honestly. "No," Jasper said. "You won't for a while, but when you do, remember it." Will nodded with the particular acceptance of a child who has been given something he does not yet know how to use but has decided to keep. Belle, from where she sat in the grass, said, "Will, come here." Will went. She made room for him beside Ruth and Clara, and the 4 of them sat in a small, warm arrangement in the summer grass. And Jasper looked at them with the specific vision that comes from knowing exactly what you are seeing. Not the idealized version, not the wished-for version, but the actual true specific version, which was his family on a ridge above a creek on a Saturday morning in June of 1891, more real and more his than anything he had ever deserved to have and had worked every day. In all the small trying ways that actually constitute trying to be worthy of, he sat down with them. Belle shifted to make room and his shoulder came against hers and she leaned into him briefly, the way she did when she was exactly where she wanted to be. Ruth grabbed his sleeve. Clara was already talking about the hawk. "There," Clara said, pointing. "Do you see it? It goes around and around and it doesn't get dizzy. Do you think it gets dizzy?" "I don't think hawks get dizzy," Will said with the authority of someone who has no actual information on the subject but is confident anyway. "How do you know?" Clara said. "I just know," Will said. "That's not a reason," Belle said, without any particular heat, because this was a conversation she'd had about the importance of evidence and reason many times with many members of the household. "She's right," Jasper said to Will. Will accepted this with the slight heaviness of a child discovering that both parents have a coordinated position on logic. "Maybe it doesn't get dizzy," he amended. "Better," Belle said. Ruth, who had been quietly examining a blade of grass for some time, held it up to show her mother. Belle looked at it with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered to her children. "Very good," she said. "It's grass," Will said. "It's her grass," Belle said. "There's a difference." Jasper watched his wife look at their youngest child with the precise and genuine attention that was the most fundamental thing Belle Barrett had ever been. Not cold, not sharp, not any of the things a man who had never truly looked had described in a saloon in Wichita, but present. Wholly, completely, fully present to the things and people she cared for, with a quality of attention that was itself a form of love, maybe the most essential form, the willingness to actually see what is there. He had been right on that first Wednesday. She had been worth paying attention to. She had been worth every morning since. She was worth every morning to come. The hawk turned above the valley in wide, patient circles, moving on the warm, rising air with the ease of a thing doing exactly what it was made for. The creek moved below, as it always had, carrying the light on its surface, clear all the way down. They stayed on the ridge until the sun was high and Ruth had fallen asleep across Belle's knees, and Clara had exhausted her current theories about hawks, and Will had discovered something interesting involving a stick and the edge of the bank that required brief and decisive adult intervention. Then they gathered themselves and walked back toward town, through the tall grass and the summer morning, the family they had made, ordinary and complete. In the evenings of that summer and the ones that followed, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet in the way, it was only quiet between approximately 9 at night and 6 in the morning, Jasper and Belle sat on the porch they had extended in 1889 and talked or did not talk, read or simply sat in the comfortable inhabited silence they had made their own language. Sometimes she read aloud to him, which she had started doing early in their marriage and which had become, over the years, one of his private favorite things. Her voice doing words she found meaningful had a quality he could not entirely describe and did not need to. It was simply one of the textures of being home. Sometimes he told her about his day, the details of the office, the situations his deputies had managed, the administrative complexities of running a town's peace. She listened the way she always listened, with the full attention she gave to things that mattered, and asked the kinds of questions that showed she had heard everything and had thought about it from an angle he hadn't considered. Sometimes they talked about the children, the specific individual texture of each of them, the questions Will was asking these days, and the ways Clara surprised them, and Ruth's growing vocabulary, which at 4 was already making its opinions known with considerable clarity. Sometimes they sat without talking, and the quiet was the best part. Belle Barrett, who had arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1882 carrying a trunk and $42 and the unasked-for verdict of a man who had called her impossible, had built something in this town, and with this man that was as solid and real and worth keeping as anything she had known. She had not built it from the softened, convenient version of herself that Franklin Holt had wanted. She had built it entirely from who she was, the organized, precise, direct, honest, fiercely attentive woman she had always been, and Jasper Sawyer had not asked her to be anything different for a single day of the years they had spent together. That was the thing about trying, the real kind. It did not ask you to be less. It asked you to show up as you were, and to find the person you were with also showing up as they were, and to choose each other from that honest place and keep choosing each other every day in all the small particular ways that constituted a real choice. It was not complicated. It had only ever looked complicated from the outside, to people who were not doing it. From the inside, from the exact specific inside of a porch on the east side of Caldwell, Kansas, on a summer evening in the early 1890s, with 3 children asleep inside and a dog on the step and a horse in the paddock and a green stone ring on a woman's finger and a badge on a man's coat hanging just inside the door, it was the most straightforward thing in the world. It was simply 2 people paying attention to each other every day. It was simply trying, done right. Ruth grew into a girl as serious and observant as her father and as precise as her mother, and people who knew the family said she was somehow both of them at once, which Belle found accurate and which Jasper found quietly wonderful. Clara grew into a young woman of extraordinary warmth, who had a particular talent for bringing people into conversation with each other, a gift that her mother recognized as its own form of intelligence, and her father recognized as something rarer than most people knew. Will grew into the kind of young man that small towns are glad to have principled in the way of someone who has thought about it rather than inherited it, able and willing and honest in the specific way of his mother, and patient in the specific way of his father. By the middle of the decade, Jasper had been Marshal of Caldwell for more than 10 years. He had seen the town through its changes with the steady, careful attention that had always characterized him, and Caldwell was the better for it, and knew it. His deputies were well chosen and well trained, and the town was, by any reasonable measure, a good place to live. Belle's store continued and thrived. She had expanded it once more in 1893, adding a modest lending section of books and periodicals that she had proposed to Harmon Webb's ghost in her imagination, and decided he would have approved of, since he had been a man who liked an expanded offering. It was the only place in Caldwell where you could buy both flour and read a periodical from back east, and the combination was, it turned out, popular. There was a morning in the fall of 1895 when Will came to his father's office. He was 11 now, and he had the look of someone who has been thinking about something for long enough that the thinking has reached a conclusion. Jasper recognized the expression specifically because he had seen it in the mirror. "I want to be a lawman," Will said. "When I'm grown." Jasper looked at his son for a moment. "Tell me why," he said. "Because it matters," Will said. "You keep people safe. You settle things fairly. It matters." "It does," Jasper said. "And it's hard. It means being patient when you want to act and acting when you want to be patient, and sometimes the situations are not clean or easy." "I know," Will said. "You have time," Jasper said. "There's a lot to learn between now and then." "I know," Will said again. "I'm just telling you the direction." Jasper looked at him. Belle was entirely right. This one was entirely his own person. "Your mother know you're telling me the direction?" Jasper asked. "I told her first," Will said. "What did she say?" "She said to think carefully about whether it was what I actually wanted or what I thought I was supposed to want," Will said. "And then she said if I thought carefully and it was still what I wanted, then I should do it." Jasper was quiet for a moment. That was, in perfect miniature, how Belle dealt with everything important. She insisted on the thinking first. She never interfered with the conclusion of the thinking. "Good advice," he said. "I thought carefully," Will said. "It's still what I want." "Then we'll talk more as you get older," Jasper said. "And I'll teach you what I know." Will nodded with the solid satisfaction of someone who has accomplished what they came to do. Then he left, because he had other business to attend to, because Will always had other business. Jasper sat in the quiet of his office for a moment and thought about directions. The direction this boy had come from, a ridge above a creek, a wrong horseshoe, a direct, honest woman who refused to be anything but herself, and a man who had decided that trying was not a good enough excuse to stop paying attention. The direction that had led here, to an office in a town that was home, to a life that was full. He thought of something Belle had said to him once early in their marriage, when he had asked her if she had thought in those first weeks after Franklin Holt and before Caldwell that she might not find something this good. She had thought about it for a moment and then said, "I didn't let myself think that far. I thought about the next thing. The next day, the next decision, the next direction that was available. I didn't think about whether eventually it would be good because I couldn't know that, and thinking about it would only have made the moving harder." "And when did you know it would be good?" he had asked. "When you said you came to form your own opinion," she had said. "That morning, that early." He had looked at her. "That's very fast," he had said. "I told you," she had said. "I know what I'm looking at when I pay attention." He had believed her. He still did. Belle came to meet him for their noon meal on a Friday in October of 1895, as she often did when the store was slow enough to allow it, and they sat across from each other at the small table in his office with bread and whatever Martha Barrett had sent over, because Martha had not entirely stopped her strategic food deployment even now that they were long since out of the Barrett house. "Will came to see me," Belle said. "He came to see me too," Jasper said. "He's decided his direction," she said. "He has." She looked at him. "Is that all right with you?" "It's his direction," Jasper said. "I'll teach him everything I know." She smiled. That smile, rare as it was, full of the warmth she kept private and gave only when something had genuinely reached her. "You're a good father," she said. "I learned from someone who has very high standards for what good looks like," he said. "Jasper Sawyer," she said, with the tone she used for things he said that were simultaneously accurate and embarrassing to receive. "Belle Sawyer," he said. She shook her head, but she was still smiling, and that was how they sat in his office in Caldwell, Kansas in the autumn of 1895. Two people who had found each other at an ordinary crossing of ordinary lives, and had paid the kind of attention to each other that made everything that followed not just possible but inevitable. The kind of love that is not dramatic in its daily expression, but is vast in its accumulated weight. The kind built from 9,000 small, honest moments rather than a single grand one. The kind that Franklin Holt, with all his words in all his saloons, could not have imagined, because imagining it would have required him to understand what trying actually was. Trying was this noon meal, this office, this woman across the table, this town outside the window that they had made their home together, year by careful year. These three children who were each entirely their own people and entirely made of both of them. This was the whole of it, the whole of what had been called impossible, and it was the most possible thing Jasper Sawyer had ever known.